watching Thunderbolts. And originally I wasn't going to see it. I'm not a big fan of Marvel movies, but surprisingly this one was pretty good. I ended up seeing it because a coworker recommended it, said that, and also some of the reviews that I saw said that it kind of had a spy-y, espionage-ish type feel to it. I don't think that's quite accurate, but where I think the reviews were accurate was in describing it as being enjoyable. The early Marvel movies I enjoyed, so like the early Spider-Mans, X-Men's and whatnot, but I couldn't really get into the Avengers. I did like the Iron Man movies, but I feel like the more recent ones that I've seen haven't been that great, and I haven't really enjoyed. So I've skipped a lot of the more recent Marvel movies, but this was actually pretty enjoyable. I thought the acting was good, the action was good, the story actually, it unbelievable in our world, but for intents and purposes worked in comparison to some of the other stories where like they were just kind of ridiculous. But here, I felt like everything came together really well. I liked the fighting sequences, bit of witty dialogue, but overall I felt like everything was well balanced and it made for a very enjoyable movie. So with that, I'm happy that, I stepped out of my comfort zone, didn't just go according to my assumptions and came out and actually saw it and found it enjoyable. So I would recommend it, especially if you could see it in theaters.
My plan was to see Thunderbolts at the AMC Madison 8. Leave there, head to the other theater to see the rest of the movies. But in leaving the AMC, like a car smashed into an electrical pole, brought it down, the cops shut down the block, so I had to detour, which resulted in me having to drive through the Krog Street tunnel. And it took forever to get into the tunnel and then forever to get out, like about a good 3 song lengths, which felt like an absolute eternity. I got to Qdoba with just enough time to pick up my lunch, scramble over to the AMC Parkway point, and check in for my movie. It was supposed to be a relaxing lunch, didn't work out that way at all. But fortunately, I made it to the movie. I did miss the previews, but I was just, I think, like maybe 5 minutes or so late to the start of the movie.
Throw that on your grill with a little butter. Got yourself a meal.
I did see Friends, which I was a little bit undecided. It seemed like it was described as being a comedy, but in watching the trailer and, the lead character's awkward behavior, I kind of felt like it might turn into a horror film. And in some ways it certainly is, but there's a good bit of like awkward humor in there. And I wasn't expecting to dislike it, but I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was a good blend of awkwardness and comedy, similar to some other films, but I think different enough to make it enjoyable and feel fresh and different. You have like Paul Rudd, and there's this other actor that I guess people know of. No disrespect to him, but I'm not really familiar with the lead actor. But in speaking to other people about upcoming movies that they were excited to see, this wasn't one that people were talking about, but in looking through like the AMC app for upcoming movies, I saw that one, and there's this website that I checked to see about upcoming movies, and it seemed like it might be interesting, so I decided to check it out, and I was actually happy that I did. Pretty interesting storyline, not like the most avant-garde or different thing. Like I feel there are similar movies if you think of like Single White Female, where basically some lonely person makes friends with someone else and just is weird and awkward and socially inappropriate and uncomfortable moments ensue. This is certainly along those lines. I feel like there's enough here that's sort of different to still make the movie pretty interesting. And so with that, is it worth seeing in theaters? I think it's like a movie that you can watch at home, but like if you're at the movie seeing other things, I don't see any reason not to. I don't regret coming out to see it. I thought like it was a really good movie. I didn't feel like it was overly long or anything like that. And I enjoyed it from start to finish. I laughed, throughout the film, and so did the other people in my theater. And I think that most people would enjoy it. It was like, good, it wasn't quite 2 hours, it more like an hour and 40 minutes or something like that. Probably a little bit shorter if you take out the time for the credits. But overall, I enjoyed it and thought it was definitely worth checking out.
So I decided that I wanted a sweet treat. Häagen-Dazs. It was convenient because I was able to place a pickup order. Got there, ice cream was ready, hopped back in my car, raced back to the theater, sat down just in time to watch the start of Final Destination Bloodlines.
I saw Final Destination Bloodlines today. I think for the Final Destinations, I've probably just seen the first one, but I saw this one of my coworkers was planning to see it as well. And in reading the reviews and watching the trailer, I was like, I think this might be an interesting movie to come see. And I am actually glad that I came to see it. Now, obviously, it's sort of like not my typical genre in that I generally stay away from horror or gore movies because I find like the gore to be kind of cheesy and the stories and acting tends to be bad. It's not terrible here, but it's better than it is in most movies. And while the movie is gory, it's like the nature of it. I still think there's like some creativity, not necessarily violent, but there is gore. But if you're familiar with the series, it's the characters trying to avoid death, and death pretty much tries to kill them in rather creative ways. And this film is kind of in keeping with that, where over the course of the film you have this family where starting with the grandmother that she avoided death through premonitions, and now you've had this through the generations on down to the granddaughter. And basically it's about this current generation trying to avoid death. And, death comes for them in some pretty interesting ways. And not to give the film away or anything like that, because the manner in which they just freak accidents is sort of what happens. It's not really like, people getting shot or, car accidents or typical things. It's like these little freak accidents, that occur, something as minor as like a penny being like the deciding factor. It's sort of, if you think of like dominoes, right? Where if you've ever seen like where people set up like dominoes, it's like, one domino and it knocks over the next and it knocks over the next, and like you see really complex domino setups, and it does all kinds of things. Or if you think of like cartoons with like mouse traps where this thing knocks that thing over and it just goes on and does all of this creative stuff. The film in some senses kind of reminded me of that, where it's like these little minor things set off a chain of events that results in a character's death. So it actually ends up being quite interesting, where unlike your typical horror movie or gore movie, where it's just, someone gets shot or they get hit with an axe or something like that, here there's at least a little bit more creativity with it. And so with that, it made it more interesting for me in comparison to some other horror films. And so with that, I definitely recommend the movie. I thought it was very enjoyable. Not my typical type of film, but stepping outside of my comfort zone, I found that it still kept me really entertained.
Picked up some Wingstop because the last movie of the day had about a 3-hour runtime, which would coincide with when I typically eat dinner. A nice little 6-piece combo. Went with the mango habanero and cajun, half and half, with some seasoned fries. Had an offer from Wingstop for an order of 5 additional wings, so decided to try out their new Mexican street spice. Everything tastes great, and because of the order, I ended up splitting it in half, eating half of it then, and then eating the other half over the weekend while I watched The Last of Us season finale.
Mission Impossible. I've actually been looking forward to this movie since 2023. I didn't go to see Mission Impossible, Dead Reckoning, which came out in 2023, because by the time I became aware of it, I hadn't been to the movies in quite some time. And by the time I became aware of it, it had just left theaters, and I watched the trailer and I was like, oh, that's actually kind of cool. I wish that I had been to see it. And I saw that there was going to be a second part to it, but that it wouldn't be out until 2025. And so with that, it's been on my radar since then, and I've just been counting down the time until it was released, as I actually really, really like the first Mission Impossible. I like action films, and the first Mission Impossible still ranks as one of my absolute favorite action films of all time. Just the scene of Ethan Hunt breaking into the safe room at the CIA headquarters is just still stands as one of my absolute favorite scenes in a movie. And so I've seen some bits and pieces of the other Mission Impossible movies since then, but not consistently. And for some of them, I haven't seen them in their entirety. So in the lead up to this film, I decided to at least go back and watch the first part to the Reckoning movie. And I thought it was okay. I thought the story felt a little bit clunky, but the action was actually very exciting, especially towards the end of that film. I feel like the other Mission Impossible films I've probably seen bits and pieces of, but certainly haven't sat down to watch in their entirety. So I do plan to catch up on those, to watch them. This is Memorial Day weekend, to catch up on them over the course of the weekend. But in coming out to see this one, Dead Reckoning, which might possibly be the last in the franchise, I was actually surprised by how much I enjoyed it. And, you know, I don't always watch reviews, but I did with this one just to get an idea of if it was worth seeing, because I expected it to be like 2 hours, as most films are in that range, but was a little apprehensive when I saw that it was going to clock in at almost 3 hours. I don't think it's the greatest action film. I think that the first Mission Impossible still, you know, is the gold standard for me. So I certainly wouldn't put this film over that one, but I think it's still pretty enjoyable. This film here, I really like the action. I felt the story felt a little bit better than the first part, and I can't remember who said it, but like one of the reviewers actually made a really good point where in 2023, when the first film came out, there was all this AI mention and stuff like that. It seemed a little bit clunky within the story for the first one, but here, especially with how far AI has come in the years since, it actually feels very relevant. And while, you know, AI is a concern with regards to people and their jobs and all of these other things, and falsification of images and all this kind of stuff, like I know this from uploading things to YouTube, where you have to state if, you know, images were modified or artificially created and whatnot, feels pretty relevant. And then when you take into account the current political climate and whatnot, the movie actually feels very relevant. Can't quite pinpoint what the major difference is, but I feel like this part two, having seen part one just, I think that was yesterday, I actually think this is quite a bit better than the first part. The story just feels a little bit better. And in watching the two, like the action in the first part was pretty good, but here I think like they did a really great job. If you consider, not to give anything away, but there's like quite a few tense moments and whatnot. Obviously, you know, Ethan Hunt is going to make it through the movie because you're sitting there and it's like, well, there's a whole other hour and a half to an hour left. And I know they're not going to kill him now. But in watching the movie, you have like these really tense moments, and something that stuck out to me was like the use of sound, where it's like you have entire stretches where it's just, you know, just sound effects. You know, no dialogue, no music really or anything like that, just sound effects. And it's absolutely, like there's a scene on a submarine, on not really abandoned, but you can refer to it as an abandoned submarine. And I, as someone that can't swim and is nervous about being out in the open ocean, I found that those scenes to be, like the submarine scenes to be made me feel like really claustrophobic, you know, so it was like especially tense for me. Silent, but for the most part, you were just hearing like the sound effects. No dialogue because, you know, there's not like anyone else for the characters to speak to. And there's kind of this unbelievable scene, Ethan Hunt on an airplane, which you see in like the movie posters and whatnot. That one I felt was interesting, but at the same time a little bit hokey because it was so unbelievable. I felt like the submarine scene was more thrilling for me. You know, the airplane scene, in a sense, it's like a different take on it, but reminded me in some ways of South by Southwest. But in this case here, Ethan Hunt is the one kind of pursuing the airplane rather than the other way around. But overall, I like really enjoyed the film. You know, and I love Angela Bassett, so it was nice to see her here, as well as like a few other actors where I might not necessarily know their names, but you know, I've seen them in other TV shows and movies and things like that, so interesting to see them here. And overall, I like really enjoyed the movie. I was surprised by how much I liked it. I saw it in Dolby. Putting everything together, I felt like it was a really nice, cohesive film. Is it a classic? Would I put it up against the first Mission Impossible or the Bourne trilogy? No, but on its own, I think it's still a pretty enjoyable action film and definitely worth checking out.